Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening or this afternoon, wherever you're coming from. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today. We'll get started in just a few moments. We'll let people trickle in here. In the meantime, if you'll introduce yourself in the chat, that would be great. Just share your name and where you're coming from. And if you're part of a congregation or a faith community, go ahead and share that as well. Okay, welcome everyone. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the first webinar in the Creation Justice Ministry Summer Reads series. My name is Avery Davis Lamb. I'm a co-executive director of Creation Justice Ministries. The mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to educate, equip, and mobilize Christians and Christian institutions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. And before handing it over to Derek, who's going to be our facilitator tonight, I just want to say a few words about this Summer Read series and about our special guest tonight. So throughout the next 3 months, we're going to be exploring the themes of birth, death, and resurrection in a climate-changed world. These are themes that are familiar to those of us in Christian communities, the hope that comes in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, Emmanuel, God with us, the death of Jesus on the cross at the hand of the empire, the good news that death is not the end, and that through the resurrection, God redeems and restores and makes all things new. These are also themes that are familiar to those of us who look deeply at the more than human world around us. In creation, we're wrapped up in the never-ending cycle of birth, death, and resurrection. As our agrarian patron Saint Wendell Berry put it, the soil is enriched by all things that die and enter into it. It keeps the past, not as history or as memory, but as richness, new possibility. Its fertility is always building up out of death into promise. Death is the bridge or the tunnel by which its past enters its future. I don't think it's coincidence that we find the themes of birth, death, and resurrection in both our Christian story and the ecologies that are unfolding around us. There's an underlying truth to this cycle that perhaps we need to listen more closely to in our climate changing world. As the world around us seems to be dying, to be passing into that dark bridge, how is birthing an act of courage? How is dying an act of possibility? What does gritty, grounded resurrection look like in a doom-filled world? These are the questions that we'll be holding with us through these 3 summer sessions. And thankfully, these are the questions that our featured authors have been wrestling with and rumbling with, not trying to seek an answer, but like Isaac and the angel, wrestling to seek a blessing. And we here tonight are blessed to be joined by Elizabeth Rush. Derek will provide a full introduction in just a few moments, but I wanted to take a moment of privilege to frame tonight's conversation and share why we're so excited to have her join us. I picked up The Quickening last October, knowing that if it was anything like her previous book, Rising, Dispatches from the New American Shoreline, it would be personal, profound, and provocative. It exceeded my expectations. Without giving too much away before the conversation actually starts, I wanted to share a quote from the book, a reflection that Elizabeth shares as she witnessed the calving of the Thwaites Glacier. She writes, "I've wondered if the prolific calving we witnessed was a fecund or a fatal act, a birthing ritual or death throes, transformation or a trauma, calving, or collapse? But what if it isn't one or the other? These questions, for both Rush and for myself, quickly become questions of mothering and parenting. Is giving birth in a time of climate change a fecund or a fatal act? Is it a hopeful act or a harrowing one? These questions haunt me personally as I ponder whether to bring children into this world. Questions like, am I damning them to live a life in the hellscape of climate collapse? Maybe. Am I inviting them into the deep beauty of this world and hoping for a livable future? Maybe. So, The Quickening and all of Elizabeth's books and essays are for anyone who can't find easy answers to these questions, and for anyone who is looking for a companion to ask the deep questions of birth, death, and resurrection. So, Elizabeth, I'm personally so delighted to have you with us tonight and to sit back and enjoy this conversation. So, thanks for being here. And with that, I'm pleased to pass it along to my colleague, Derek Weston, to take it on from here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Derek Weston. I'm the Theological Education and Training Coordinator for Creation Justice Ministries. And I'm thrilled that you are all with us for what is sure to be an excellent conversation with Elizabeth Rush. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Please introduce yourself in the chat if you have not yet. Be sure to select everyone so that we all know who's here. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the program. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function, not in the chat. That way, it's easier for us to keep track of them. If you look in your bottom screen, you'll see a space right next to the share screen or the polls and quizzes that says Q&A. That's where we'd like you to put your questions. And this workshop is being recorded and will be sent out to all participants via email within the next week. So, with that, just a brief introduction of Elizabeth Rush. She is the author of The Quickening, Creation and Community at the Ends of the Earth, which we'll be discussing this evening, and Rising: Dispatches from the New American Shore, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Central to Rush's writing practice is the act of listening to those who live in frontline climate change communities, listening to Antarctica's great glaciers as they go to pieces, listening to all those voices long locked out of environmental conversations. Work explores a couple of fundamental questions. What does our disassembling world ask of us? And how can we continue to live and love while also losing much? Rush spent many years reporting from coastal communities, already feeling the pressure of higher tides and stronger storms. Rush's work has appeared in a wide range of publications, from the New York Times to Orion. She is the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts, the National Science Foundation, National Geographic, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Howard Foundation, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and the Metcalf Institute. And right now, she's in Providence, Rhode Island with her children and husband, but she's getting ready for a pretty big move, which we might talk about later on. But Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for this great gift that you have given us in The Quickening.
My goodness, my pleasure. And thank you so much, Avery, for your such kind words, and for reading so closely. And thank you, Derek, for being my conversant. I'm so thrilled to be with you all tonight.
So there's a lot going on in this book, The Quickening, and so and as a writer myself, I'm always really interested in what leads people to the place where they are wanting to write on a particular subject. So, talk to us about the steps that led to wanting to write The Quickening. What was bubbling up for you? And I love how even in our pre-conversation, you spoke so much about listening. What were you listening to at the time that brought you to the writing of The Quickening?
That's a great question. I've never thought about it as what I was listening to at the time. I had been listening for almost a decade to the voices of people living on the coastline of the United States whose lives were already being sort of profoundly changed by sea level rise. And some part of me, after a decade of listening to those sort of lived experiences of flooding and climate change in the present moment, some part of me was like, oh, I really want to see the source of those changes up close, because I'm a very experiential learner. I thought, like, okay, if I can carry my body close to these gigantic glaciers at the bottom of the planet that are disintegrating, maybe I'll understand something about what's happening to all of us um, more profoundly. So it was like, like a seeker's journey. And then I went to the library, as one does when about to set out on a new project, and I took out a bunch of books. My first impression of the Antarctica section at the library was like, oh, there's not much that's been written about Antarctica. And one of the most fascinating things that I found out very early on was that the first person to see Antarctica saw it 200 years ago. And so every single story that we have that is the result of a direct human physical presence in Antarctica or on or near Antarctica has been written in the last 200 years. And so I started to read those stories. I think that's some of the listening that I was doing. And I got really bored really fast. Like, they're all stories, a lot of conquest. There's a lot of masculine conquest running through those stories. Who gets to the South Pole first? Who gets to name this glacier after themselves or that glacier? So I got really bored with that sort of literary tradition. And at the same time, I was really thinking about and wanting to bring a child into the world. My partner and I felt like we finally had stable jobs. We finally had love to kind of imagine sheltering that child with. And so we started having these conversations about having children and wanting to have children. And then I feel like I'm telling the long version of the story, but I will speed
Nope.
it up. I
Great.
got accepted to go to Antarctica on a really groundbreaking scientific mission on board a research icebreaker, headed to Thwaites Glacier, which we were going to a part of this glacier that had never before been visited by humans. And in order to go on the mission, I had to prove that I wasn't pregnant. I had to take a pregnancy test because they didn't want pregnant women gumming up the works down there, which tells you a lot about how the works work in Antarctica. But somehow that forbiddenness made me think maybe I should write about these two things together. What would happen if I carry my longing on this mission? How will seeing this glacier change it? And how will being a woman wanting a child change the way I see the glacier? And I feel like that's kind of like the question that felt interesting to me that I could burrow down inside of.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
and,
how I
and
got
it's
there.
thank you. And it's beautiful the way that throughout the book you're holding these questions side by side of sort of the exploration of Antarctica and this exploration of yourself and your own internal motives and your own internal questioning and wrestling. Um, and particularly your wrestling around climate change and the effects that our actions are having on this glacier. And I'm interested in hearing as the journey begins and you're thinking about you're even wrestling. There's a place in the book where you're even wrestling about the the effect on the environment that just having the expedition will have,
Totally.
and having to do all of this internal wrestling and rationalization of well, but the things we'll learn from it will be so worth it, and all these sorts of things. I'm wondering how that pressure of even, so often we've framed climate change as sort of this personal, you know um the ways of our personal actions have this deep effect on the world, and how are you holding that question of your own personal actions, because that feels like that's a lot of what's weighing on you as you begin this journey of your personal actions and how they are affecting the world.
Totally. I mean, absolutely. I'd been writing for a decade on the fact that climate change was happening. And so in the present tense, like it's not something in the future, it's happening now. Um and the burning of fossil fuel is what drives it. We have been taught to think about what personal actions we take can slow that down or stop it or contribute less. And so, I was deep in this mindset of kind of thinking two things at once. Like one was what's the carbon footprint of this mission? What's the carbon footprint of having a child? How do I calculate that? And I fell down some really interesting rabbit holes. There used to be a website called shameplane.com, and you put in how far you're traveling on an airplane, and it would tell you how many square kilometers of Arctic ice sheets you're gonna
Oh, God.
melt. And I was like, oh, how many, so I think I was like melting, I don't remember, but I wanted to see how much my flight to Bogota would melt. And then I was like, let me calculate how many gallons, hundreds of thousands of gallons of gas we're going to burn on this ship. How much ice will that melt? Um, and you're right. And then I was like, but hopefully the things we learn are going to like lead to the legislation that will tax the fossil fuels that we pull out of the ground or forbid the fossil fuels from being pulled out of the ground. Um, you know, I still, and I feel like there's kind of a punchline in here that maybe I don't want to get to quite yet, but I still go to the grocery store and I still think, what's better, the organic asparagus that uh or like the organic tomatoes that come from California but are in a plastic container, or the
Mm,
non-organic that are in a paper container and they're from New Jersey. Like the rabbit holes abound and we all
mm,
encounter them all the time. And I knew something in my gut told me this is all a diversion, or the question of bringing a
mm,
child into the world and trying to put it into that logic felt disingenuous. It was like, it told me, the one decision you can make that will keep more carbon in the ground, these carbon footprint calculators, they would say the one decision you can make is to have one fewer child. Like you get an electric car, that'll keep, I don't know, 1/20th of the CO2 in the atmosphere, in the ground, that in comparison to having a kid, like the bar graphs are just
mm,
really substantially different. Um, but some part of me was like, I don't know. They're different. Having a kid is not buying a car.
mm,
Uh, and so I spun out in this question for
mm,
years. I think many people have.
mm,
And so some part of me tries to record some of that spinning out in the question in the book because I think it's probably pretty familiar to
mm.
folks.
And I
Yeah.
and I I really appreciate how vulnerable you are in some of that spinning out of it's not it's not an easy wrestling. You are literally considering every side of the conversation as you go through the book. I wanted to I wanted to ask this question because um, the book actually starts with your mother giving a
Mhm.
narrative of your birth story. And a little bit of a spoiler alert, but I kind of think we did that already in the bio. You do decide to have children,
Yeah.
and you give the a little bit of the birth story of your firstborn.
Mhm.
And throughout the book, you're asking people questions about their own birth stories or the birth stories of their children. And they're really powerful narratives of those moments when life is coming into the world. There's beauty and there's some very humanness in those birth stories. Um, Talk to us a little bit about the power of those birth stories, both in terms of the ones that um, your own, your children, but also you clearly saw some merit in asking people about birth stories and it's a huge part of the narrative here is
Yeah.
hearing a birth story. So tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about the power of those birth stories for you.
So, I mean, I'm like, everyone here has homework. Go ask someone their own birth story. Go listen to your mom tell the story of how you were born. Birth stories, I think, are some of the most compelling narratives that I've ever bore witness to. Um, and I can remember the first birth story I heard. It was one of my dear friends. She got married um kind of young, and she was the first person to share with me her birth story. She wrote it out. It was 9 pages, and I read
Mm.
it and was just like, I had no idea that that was what birth was like. So not only are they fascinating, but there's also like a somewhat significant taboo around them.
Mm.
um you don't hear them much unless you seek them out.
Mhm.
I found them so compelling, and I thought, what better way to kind of push up against or respond to these masculine narratives of conquest that swirl around Antarctica than to ask every single person on the mission what they knew about their birth. And I think that that's important because also we often think of Antarctica as sort of like a harbinger of apocalypse, like the glaciers are collapsing, the end of the world is coming, and it's from Antarctica. And I was like, well, what if we start to think about Antarctica and birth together? Like, what happens when we
Mm.
do that? And I got to listen to all these birth stories on a boat that women were like literally forbidden from,
Mm.
embarking on a couple of decades earlier. And so that felt kind of transgressive and exciting. Um, and birth takes tremendous courage. It takes tremendous sort of self-obliteration, a
Mm.
willingness to cede control. And I think those are all things that are worth thinking about cultivating right now. And so the book opens with my mom's birth story. It more or less closes with my story of giving birth to my son. And there's something I think really profound and cyclical in that. And funnily enough, my son and I share a birthday. So he was born on May 26th, which is my birthday. And so it felt very full circle for me to kind of
Mm.
bookend this project with those two stories.
Yeah, and I love that as bookends. Just a side note, I've asked my mom about my birth story. I was the third of four for her, and she likes to tell me that I was her quickest labor, and that was
Huh.
the last fast thing I did.
How's this
Um,
for fast? My second was born in our car. We didn't make
Wow.
it to the hospital. Uh, she was born. We were literally flying down the highway, and she was born at like, I don't know, 50 miles an hour. It was wild. It was totally wild.
At some
We can
point,
get into that.
hopefully you'll write about that as well at some point. I want to come back to you've touched on this a couple of times, and I had a aha moment in reading the book that, one of those things where some of my male blinders came down. Um, because you're talking about Antarctica and you're talking about exploration and the ways in which in exploration and discovery, um, countries are often talked about in feminized language, and we
Mm,
talk about new lands as she,
mm,
and so there's this really um, masculine conquest and takeover um, and it bleeds into so many things as we think about the history of for those of us who are Christians, the doctrine of discovery, and we think about colonization and all of that. And I just want to take just a second to think a little bit with you about the danger of
mm.
that masculine language and where that masculine language has kind of led us, both as we think about the ways in which we talk about land, the ways in which we talk about climate, the ways in which we talk about nature and creation. I'm just wondering if you've reflected. I'm sure you have reflected on how that feminized language for land and that very masculine language for conquest has,
Yeah,
in a lot of ways, led us to the crisis we're in now.
totally. I mean, as you're speaking, I'm remembering certain phrases from these like the explorer stories. It's like her broad white bosom draws men towards it, and her impenetrable interior is their ultimate prize. And you're just sort of like, oh, um, why is that a problem? At a deep level, it invites violence upon that body, that land body, that earth body. And it makes those things sort of like ripe for the reaping. And um, it also assumes a kind of passivity that maintains, be it like the masculine actor or the human actor as the actor, and not thinking about this kind of, that there might be a reciprocal relationship between the land and the people who dwell upon it. And so, for all of those reasons, this language is part of the climate crisis. And I sometimes think about something that a good friend of mine, Bathsheba DeMuth, who also kind of works in this space, although she works a lot in the Arctic with indigenous peoples there. Um, we were sort of opine, we were just sort of like, I don't know. Sometimes movement feels slow, right? Sometimes it feels like, okay, we've been laboring in this space for a long time. Um, and she looked at me and she was like, oh, this is like an intergenerational relay race, because we're not just trying to stop the
Mm-hmm.
burning of fossil fuels. We're actually trying to like fundamentally shift the way our culture relates to the earth. So like that's not going to happen in a day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going to happen in 10 years either. And somehow thinking about, like passing a baton in a relay race and the time frame of that race taking a bit longer than I'd like, was really helpful. And I think it comes, why does it take so long? It comes back to some of these like deep-seated questions around the language that we use and how we orient. ethically towards the earth.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
that's such an important conversation because I think it helps us realize that, like, yes, there are technical adaptations that we need to make, but there are also, the language I would use is there are spiritual adaptations that we need to
Yeah.
make. There are reorientations of our soul in terms of our relationship to the created order that need to happen, that are beyond the technical fixes of, yes, we need to burn less fossil fuels. Yes, we need to, travel less or travel smarter and all these sorts of things. But we need to just think differently. And
Yeah.
some of that is language based.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really important, um, just a really important observation that you make kind of in multiple places in the book. That was just really helpful for me and really eye opening.
It also makes me think, I totally went on this mission thinking I want to recognize the glaciers as actors. I want to see
Mm,
Antarctica as an actor. And if I'm being really honest, which I think I am trying to do in the book, I don't think I succeed at that
mm,
fully. I think I'm
mm,
attempting to. Um, and I walk away from Antarctica with a sense that, like, to honor and recognize its animacy would demand a much closer relationship with it than I have. And that
mm,
relationship is kind of like borne out over time, time and place. I'm really only there a
mm,
month. Um, and so I think that also kind of comes back to this question of, like, if we're hoping for, not hoping for, but laboring towards these larger cultural shifts, um, to not be delusional. Like, they're really hard. They take a
mm,
ton of time. I spent
mhm,
5 years writing this book. I spent a month in Antarctica, and what I aspire to, I don't think I completely succeed at. And I actually think
mm,
it's really important to have a record of some of that failing, to say, to do this work is actually harder than it appears at the surface.
mm.
That doesn't mean we don't do it, but um, it's really hard.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you for saying that. Like, I think that's a really important thing for all of us who are doing this work, to just recognize, one, that we are doing the work of several generations. We're not
yeah,
doing the work that we're going to complete in our lifetime,
yeah,
and it's really hard. And we're swimming upstream. We're swimming
yeah,
upstream. Like the direction that the culture is moving is moving and at such a pace and with such force that we're very much swimming upstream and being reminded that, yeah, it's really hard.
yeah. Like, you might
um
not make forward progress this week, and that's okay. Here's, like, someone else who tried to go forward and didn't this week. Um,
yeah,
it's good to have company, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and we'll get to that too, because that's another piece of your book that I think is pretty compelling. So maybe you didn't get quite to where you wanted to in terms of your relationship with Antarctica, but I do feel like, um, particularly, maybe not even Antarctica generally, but Thwaite in particular, like, is both sort of a backdrop and a character. And for those who maybe haven't read the book, can you, particularly in the context of this conversation, can you talk to us about calving? Can you talk to us about what it means for a glacier to be calving?
Yeah. So to calve, um, literally means to, like, split and shed a smaller mass of ice. So every single iceberg in the world is calved off of a glacier, which is actually, they call it the parent stream. So a glacier
Mm,
is like a river of ice that is steadily flowing in a gravity driven way towards the ocean, or downhill. And there's sort of two kinds of glaciers in the world: alpine glaciers, which are up in the mountains, and marine terminating glaciers, which end at the sea. So all our icebergs calve off of the end of a glacier. Um, I also find it really fascinating that we use the same word to talk about a cow giving birth to a calf. Um, and there for me, I was like, there's this resonance here, and I don't want to make too much of it, but I want the resonance to keep me open to the possibility that this thing that I've been taught to see as sort of a sign of climate doom might also be the glacier birthing into the world vis-a-vis these icebergs new possibilities, new ways of humans relating to one another in the coastal communities that are impacted, thousands and thousands of miles away. And I think I mean, I know that that is at some level a deep reduction about of what's happening, but at the same time, I think, you know, to mark it as a death cry or death toll, this act of calving, is to limit the sense of possibility that can come with it. And it
Mm.
can be sort of one and birth and death at the same time, I think is kind of where I ultimately get to. But um, it's also fascinating because we end up making it to Thwaites. It takes us a month to arrive. And while we're there, our ship is literally next to this glacier as a massive calving event happens. And it actually happens on such a scale that we don't even notice it at first. We keep
Mm.
working in the area around this glacier, deploying our little submarines and getting like sediment samples up from the seafloor. And meanwhile, a like 30-mile wide, 15-mile deep chunk of the front of the glacier has shattered into hundreds of icebergs.
Wow.
Um, and for me, that was the moment where I was like, oh, I can't even see it, and it's happening right in front of me. I have no business, I don't know. I know that the glacier is alive. Do I know what it's saying? Absolutely not. I can't even
Mm.
see what's happening.
Mm.
So that was really powerful.
Mm. Yeah, that's incredible. And the language and imagery that you use in describing that experience is so evocative, and you do a really good job of bringing the reader into that experience and into the awe and wonder of that
Yeah,
experience, and yet the kind of the confusion of that experience as well. It just feels like that had to have been um, a lot of inner chaos to experience that.
totally.
Um,
And the wild thing for me was, I went on this mission. I wanted to hold my desire to have a kid next to this glacier. I see the glacier falls apart, and I return home, and really my desire to have a kid has not gone away. And I think in some ways I was like, oh, well, this is not the book I thought I was going to write. Like, I don't know what
mm,
I thought I was going to write, but it turned out that I then had to figure out how to write a book that helped me survive my desire, how
mm.
helped the desire survive, because I had to figure out how I could even hold on to it. Um, it wasn't going away. So what then is being asked of me in order to keep that desire alive? So I felt
Yeah,
like the question shifted.
yeah. I'd like to talk about that a little bit, because one of the wrestlings that kind of comes up throughout the book, and a word that kind of comes up throughout the book, is selfish.
Mm,
That this desire to have a child, to bring a child into the world, and particularly into the climate changed world, feels selfish. And you wrestle with that. Other people on the voyage or on the expedition are wrestling with that. Um, and I think that uh, is Guy or Guy, is that how you
Key,
pronounce it?
key.
He
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
He talks about sort of his parents' motives of having children and sort of like these more traditional notions of family of being what drove him and we've never really thought I don't think at any other point in history did we ever feel like that drive for family did we ever really name that drive for family as selfish
Yeah.
but now we are in a way that hasn't been that feels kind of historically unique
Yeah.
and so I'm really interested, and you're saying, having this experience and this drive not going away. Um, how do you still wrestle with that notion of selfishness and the feeling of a selfish desire to have family, to bring a child into the world? That's a very heavy thing. A lot of which is driven by the kind of personal responsibility narrative, but just in your own wrestling with that, talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I can say now that I have two children, I actually experience parenthood as one of the least selfish decisions one can make. You
And all
just
the
like,
parents say amen.
yeah, like, didn't know that that was going to be what it was. I think I think that right now we're in a moment where sometimes people look, in myself included, previously a previous version of myself would kind of look to someone wanting a child and it's like, well, do you just want to like make a photocopy of yourself, or do you uh like, this is a desire you have, but and especially at this sort of like climate hinge point, you have this desire, but the world you're going to bring that kid into, you don't know how bad it's going to get. So you're imagining them in a world that's somewhat like today. And it's selfish for you to want their company because the world of 40 years from now, we know is not going to look like today, for better, for worse. Um, and so I mean, I do think that really like the choice, the idea of reproducing right in this decade that we're in, where it's like we know that it's getting worse and worse. The actions to mitigate that are not happening fast enough. We're really in this like sort of open moment. I think the choice to have a child in 20 years from now will feel different because they will know a lot more about how we're responding and also how the earth is changing. But right now it feels like we're kind of, it's like, ugh, this could go not just one of two ways, but one of 1,000 ways. Um, and so you have to make a decision inside that space. And yeah, I think that we have been taught to reduce, and this kind of gets back to something we were talking about. We've been taught to reduce our climate action to the level of the individual, and that it should be about getting a car or not having a kid or being a vegan. And I read something in my wrestling that really shifted how I relate to carbon footprints, which is this pretty, I think it's become more widely known, although maybe not as widely known as I wish it was, that the idea of a carbon footprint as something that we should calculate and that should be attached to an individual, that idea is really um, popularized by British Petroleum in 2006. And you can see, you can track linguistic usage of the word, of the phrase carbon footprint. And before 2006, it's like down here on the chart. And after 2006, it just rises to the sky. And so, really, this idea of thinking about individual action as the space where you're going to make your climate impact is a logic that is drilled into us by the oil and gas industry to keep us out of power by joining with other people towards
Mm,
more collective action. Um, And when I read that, I mean, I'm literally getting goosebumps just thinking about it. I read it in an article by a woman who's become a friend, me and Chris, and my guilt and my sense of selfishness morphed somewhat radically into rage pretty quickly. That not just me, but every other person who's been thinking about having children in this moment in time are really thinking about it in this really narrow lens. And that we've been taught to do that by the oil and gas industry. I mean, I just wanted to be like, get your filthy fingers out of my womb. Like you're not, you have no, you have no invitation to that space. I will take it back from you now. So that was pretty liberating. But even so, I still can get a little lost in that sensation of climate selfishness. We are taught it at so many different junctures.
Yeah. Well, and particularly, and you do a great job of highlighting BP's complicity in this language, and it both, particularly for us as Americans, it both feeds into our individualism
Right.
that we can make individual decisions all on our own that will either save the planet or destroy the planet.
Yeah.
And it also feeds into our consumerism that if we buy the right things or
Right.
don't buy the right things, that we can save or destroy the planet.
Yeah.
Both of which kind of deny the fact that you have this corporation that is doing a lot of damage with the products that it produces and the ways that it produces them, and is not, in fact, taking accountability for what it does, and instead pushing that accountability onto us. And it is rage inducing. It really
Yeah.
is. It's incredibly
Yeah.
frustrating. Um, but one of the other beautiful things that comes out of your experience and your writing of the book is it feels like from the relationships that you built on the expedition, you gained a new sense of the value of community. And I would love to hear, not just moving away from the individualist actions that affect climate change, but it felt like for you, community kind of in some ways ended up being the antidote for a lot of the despair and a lot of the wrestling that you were feeling. So talk to us a little bit about how your understanding of community changed and evolved over the course of this expedition.
Hmm. I mean, just to set the stage a little bit, it's like there were 57 of us on a boat the length of a soccer pitch for uh 2 months straight, and there was nothing. There was no going to 7-Eleven. There was like no mail. There was no internet for most of the time. um we were really just with each other, and I experienced that as in some ways the closest I've gotten in my adult life to childhood. That sense of
Mm.
like going to your first grade class or going to summer camp and just being like, oh, I'm about to be in it with these people. And and it really like demanded a kind of openness. And I'm an introvert at heart. I was really nervous about not being able to get off the boat. But part of what happens is that you learn to take what you need for yourself to keep being okay. Like I would take time for myself, and you learn to read other people and say like, you know, when Lars has his headphones on, like don't bother the man. We had to be bored together. We also had to accomplish, like when it was time to get work done, we worked 24 hours a day in shifts for 36 days straight. Um, And it was stunning to me what we accomplished. And just as important was sharing a meal after, or the more quotidian part of life on this boat felt really, really important. And I thought, oh, community is made not just uh in doing the action together, but in taking care of one another and listening to one another and sharing a meal together. And um in many ways, that's just what that asks, is time and attention from its participants. And that came, to be honest, I came back and I think, you know, when I was younger, I used to devote 5 hours a day every day to my writing. And I didn't have kids, and I woke up and I set that aside that time. And now, I think with this knowledge of what community is and what it takes, I just see that, our lives are what we spend our time doing. And I try to give more time to the community that I'm a part of and that supports me. Um, and say to myself, like some days I don't get any writing done. Right now, I haven't gotten any writing done for, 6 months since my little one was born, and that's okay. That's just not what I'm doing right now. And to be a little easier with the individual who wants to be making and doing all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think it's so important for us, to think about the attention that is required to do community well. And I think many of us have deep desires for community, particularly as we think about the future and the world that is being created around us. We think about the communities that we need to survive the world that is being created. And yeah, the attentiveness and the listening that's involved with that. And that sometimes we have to put things down and say, I'm going to be
Yeah,
here for the people around me and not get quite as much done.
totally. I mean, I've been, even just this past month, my husband and two children and I were going to move to Colombia for a year. And one of the things that I've been trying out as we prepare to leave is just to spend more time with the people who make our lives possible in Providence. And it's been wonderful and I think really important. Like my parents are close by and they've been really sad about us leaving. And a balm, a remedy of that is like, let's be together. Let's try to not cram it into an hour here, an hour there, but come over for the afternoon. Let's just be. And that's family, but I think taking that mindset to the communities um, that we're a part of is really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I have a question or two left, but I do want to remind anyone who is here with us, if they have questions, to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will get to those. Um, so you now are in a place where you have two children.
Uh-huh.
What there are people who will be watching this and people who are going to be reading your book who are in the midst of the same wrestling that you were doing. And I'm really interested in hearing what wisdom, what guidance would you give to them? Um, and sometimes, I think advice isn't even is maybe the wrong way of framing things, but maybe I'll ask it this way: to whom should they be listening as they make that decision about bringing children into the world?
Ooh, I mean, well, that's it's so, I mean, I've regularly thought to myself, just because I have kids doesn't mean I think the reader should have kids.
Sure.
Um, and there was a version of this book that was written in the second person, and my editor was like, if you keep it in second person, it makes, which means instead of I write it as you do this, you do that. Sounds like you're making the decision for them about whether or not they should have kids.
Mm.
You have kids. And I was like, oh yeah, let's not do that. So some part of me is like, I don't listen to me or don't do what I did. That's not the point. But who should they be listening to? I have two sort of different answers. One is themselves, obviously, but as I think is evidenced, like that listening to yourself can sometimes mean you're recapitulating ways of thinking without even being that have been taught to you without even really thinking deeply about them. So I want to give a more useful, less sort of cheesy response, which is there's a book that just came out. I have a copy. It's not right here, but it's called Conceivable Futures. And it's the book that I sort of wish I had as I was wrestling with these questions, because again, it doesn't say yes or no, but it gives you the questions and it gives you the history around the questions. And there's like a history of the reproductive justice movement. There's a history of fossil fuels and carbon footprints. There's like a how there's at the end, there's sort of like the big no and the big yes. What do we need to say no to make the planet livable for all beings? What can we say yes to make the planet livable for all beings? And I think it's a really like nice companion to walk through the question with. So it's called Conceivable Futures. I'll put it in the chat. I really like it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think it is it's such a big question. It's such a personal question. And people are going to come down on this in so many different ways. And yeah, I think it's great to have as many resources and as many conversation partners as possible.
Yeah,
Um,
I feel like it kind of says like have kids, don't have kids. What we want is a future where life is viable, life is
yeah,
for not just us. Um, and so how do we get there and how do we start imagining what that looks like? So I really like it. It's great.
yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Um, Last
And
question.
put your questions in the chat. I want
Yes, put your questions in the chat.
yeah. Questions in the Q&A. Put your questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, put questions in the Q&A. Not in the chat, in the Q&A. So last question for me. Um, you talk about this a little bit at the end of the book, and I'm kind of wondering if your thinking has evolved on this at all. Where are you on the idea of going back to Antarctica?
I I stand where I uh ended at the end of the book, which is, I think about going back to Antarctica and I think, um I really devoted like 5 years of my life to this project. And I could in my brain justify going because I was making an offering of my time in service of this journey that was not insubstantial. It was a big time offering. I don't think I would go back. I think that, you know, it was extraordinary, the mission that I was invited to participate in. And anything sort of less than that feels a little bit like a defamation of what was really like a sacred, incredible space. My friend Bathsheba DeMuth, whom I really adore and respect, who works in the Arctic. She went to Antarctica, leading like a Brown University alumni cruise there. And she came back and was like, oh, it's otherworldly. Like it is unlike the Arctic. There are no people, there's a reason that it emerged from the mists 200 years ago. And some part of me wants to keep it sacred in that way. So like go if you must, but make it a spiritual pilgrimage and not just a vacation.
Yeah. Appreciate
Yeah.
that as an answer. Thank you for that. So we do have a
Yeah.
couple questions. Wendy asked, Wendy read the book. I was so pleased to see the sense of community grow on your voyage and felt that I, like you, would have to do what I could to help others accomplish their important goals. I was crushed for you when the megacore bled out on the floor. How was that
Yeah.
experience impacted you after the cruise, and how did it impact Rachel and the dissertation she was trying to give birth to?
Oh, yeah, the megacore that I dropped like this. I don't know, on our second day at Thwaites, I dropped the second core sample ever to be gathered from in front of this glacier, uh, out of an act of just not paying attention to what I was doing. And it is the most shame I have felt as an adult human being. I mean, it was awful. Uh, um, in fact, and my editor in editing the book said to me, the book has three climaxes. The first is losing the megacore. The second is the weight's collapse. And the third is your son's birth.
Mm,
Um,
mhm,
and I was like, oh, that's right. So it's an important moment.
mhm,
Um, and I think it's important in this way that I only learned from listening to other people on the ship, which was, to wallow, to spend too much time wallowing in shame would get in the way of our getting done what still needed to get done. Um, and, I think as Bastian says, like, you lose 10% of the science when you drop a sample, and that's a pain in the butt. But if you bitch and moan about it, then you've lost 20% of your time. So uh, there is such wisdom in that. And I think to me, it feels really important in the context of this moment in the climate change um, history, where I think we fret a lot about like, should we do this? Should we not do this? What's the impact? And it's also like, do your work, keep moving. Do your work,
mhm,
keep moving.
mhm,
We have
mhm,
to keep the energy alive. And not worry when we make a mistake. It's okay to make a mistake. We're gonna fail. We're gonna, have screw ups. You just got to keep showing up to the work. And did it affect, so Rachel, the megacore belonged to a PhD student who was going to write her dissertation about it. So that was the worst. I had to tell her that I lost her dissertation before it ever came to fruition. The good news is that our cruise got, 29 more megacores, and she wrote her dissertation on a different core. And I shared in writing in bringing the book into the world, I made annotated copies for every single person who speaks in the text, and I shared it with each person prior to publication and said, let me know if you want anything changed or removed. That was our bargain all along, that they would get to approve or edit the text. And Rachel's response was, I don't remember being that upset. She was like, oh my God, I was so upset. I was like, you were upset. And she's like, well, everything turned out fine. So I was like, do you want me to change it? She was like, no, I believe you. But like, I come across as like, oh, she's just kind of silent in the book. So she barely remembered it, which is kind of funny.
Mm, that's
Um,
amazing.
yeah.
All
The
right.
I feel like,
So
yeah, go.
oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think we also have questions in the chat.
Yeah, we do have questions in the chat, so I'm gonna go to those. And actually, one Avery sent to me directly, so I'm gonna start there. Um, he says, I'm thinking a lot about ritual and meaning making in a time of climate change. Birthing is something that is ritualized, baptism, naming ceremony, circumcision, etc. There are also rituals for death, funerals, etc. I think we need rituals for the things that are being born and dying around us in this time of climate change. What are some rituals that have been important for you? How do you engage in meaning making, especially in moments of birth and death?
Mm. Um, well, I'm not sure that this is exactly an answer to this question. My brain goes to kind of two different places. And one is, I don't know if you all have seen that there's now this marker in Iceland at the place where a particular glacier used to sit. I forget the name of it. It has a kind of funny name. And they made this marker to say sort of like, here's where this glacier stood. If you're standing here reading this in the future, only you know if we did anything about it.
Mm,
And I liked the questioning part of that. And some part of me was also like, how strange that I don't know, that we're responding to this disappearing glacier with like a national park sign, you know? Like,
mhm,
I don't know.
mhm,
So
mhm,
I'm glad it exists. And I also think that we're just in the process of figuring out what some of our rituals might be, and they might feel a little ham-fisted right now. And I think that's part of the sort of like try stuff on, and maybe it doesn't work. Maybe there's a failure in there, but that doesn't mean you don't try it. The other place my brain went was I have this really phenomenally gorgeous beech tree in my yard. It's almost like a sentient being. And we bought the house partly because of this tree. And there is a climate change accelerated disease called beech leaf disease that's killing beech trees all across the country at this really rapid rate. And I look at this tree that we love and I think like it's not a question of if but when. And that doesn't mean I don't continue to care for it in the present moment. So I feel like part of what it's teaching me is even though it's, you know, it will die in a climate changed way, that doesn't mean I don't get to love and care for it. And loving and caring for it might be extra painful, might mean kind of looking at death all the time through life. Um, But isn't that also a gift, right? Like, isn't if we have like a terminally ill friend and we suddenly have to sit with them with attention, knowing that they're not going to be there anymore, that attention is a blessing that they're giving you, even through the pain of their leaving. And so, to me, I feel like that's the space that I want to think about ritual in is like, what is that attending to something that's ill. I want ritual inside that space. I don't quite know that I have them, but I even the attending to feels like a ritual.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Um, Amy has a question. As an academic who feels like she's never ever producing enough, your reflections on the importance of shifting our attention to our relations, broadly construed, are so resonating with me. But my question is, how would you respond to the question, do you have hope for humanity slash the earth? Assuming it's not yes or no, I'd love to hear your thoughts and ask for your permission to share your wisdom with my students.
Um, do I
Well, the
have
easy
hope for
questions tonight.
totally, totally. Do I have hope for humanity? I was thinking about something Gary Schneider said. Do I have hope for humanity slash the earth? I was thinking about something Gary Schneider said today on my bike ride, which is the earth doesn't need us to save her. And it's a question of character, what we do. And when I hear that Earth doesn't need us to save her, I think in real long time, I think, okay, we're in the midst of the sixth extinction. There are five extinctions before this one, and look what flourished in the wake of them. Um, so that doesn't mean we don't so I think in that deep time kind of way about the earth, every single fraction of a degree we can stop the planet from heating up keeps hundreds of thousands of people out of harm's way. And so we act on their behalf in the present tense, to try to limit the warming that we're pumping into the atmosphere. So I have hope for the earth. Humanity is a different question. And I do sometimes think, even comparing how I felt about where humanity was going to be in 30 years, how I felt 4 or 5 years ago versus how I feel today, I think I'm less optimistic about, I don't know, a stable civil society in the US in 40 years, than I was even 4 or 5 years ago. Um, but I'm still glad my children are here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
Um, Anders asked this question. I noticed that the media is often speaking of Thwaites Glacier as the quote unquote doom glacier. Any thoughts on whether or not that is a helpful term? I found myself not liking people speak of the glacier that way due to your providing metaphors of the glacier as mother, etc.
Yeah, I hate calling it the Doomsday Glacier. I think um it limits the way we think about what is even happening in Antarctica. And it limits the way we think about, more specifically and more pointedly, what our response to it is. Because whether or not Thwaites is the Doomsday Glacier is completely up to us, right? Like, how are we going to respond to the fact that sea levels are rising? Will we start to help move the lowest lying, most vulnerable creatures out of harm's way? If we do that, then it's not the Doomsday Glacier. If we don't do that, then it is. So I feel like you call it the Doomsday Glacier and you're kind of baking the end of the story in, um, without thinking really about what we can do, to limit the impact of those shifts. The shifts are coming. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful framing. That if we call it Doom Glacier, that in some ways it makes you say, then what's the point?
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
even try anymore? Yeah. Thank you for that. Terry points us to radicaljoy.org for rituals for wounded places. Thank you for that, Terry.
Cool.
Um, as we wrap up, I wanted to just read this piece from the end of the book that I just feel like, in a lot of ways, sums up maybe what I need to hear, and I don't know. But this, for those of you who have a book nearby, it's on page 354. We must, in this unsettled window of time, continue with the difficult labor of living in and imagining a changed world, one that can become more equitable as a result of the climate crisis, not less. What will happen in 2100 is uncertain, but what is happening all along our coastline at the current moment is not. Our lowest lying and often low income communities are already suffering as a result of rising seas, which means we need to develop and implement a practical and flexible framework for just climate adaptation now. This framework must center the people and places hurt by half a millennium of extraction, people and places that have not as of yet received proper recompense for all they have lost along the way. Then, as the numbers become clearer, we will already have in place the laws and policies that will help us meet the challenge we face. Because real climate resilience is something we have either together or not at all. These kinds of actions can also help to tackle the existential crisis that climate change presents, and as such, are much more useful than continuing to worry about all we do not know. because if I have learned anything, it's this. Thwaites and the whole of which it is part will always be something we only partially understand. Thank you for those beautiful words. Thank you for all of the beautiful words contained in the quickening. Elizabeth, it has been a joy to spend this time with you. Thank you for being with us and just going a little deeper with us into this book. Thank you for your time.
I've so enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. Take care, everyone. And yeah, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
And so for those of you, it seems like most of you have a copy of The Quickening, but if you don't, you can go to our summer reads page at creationjustice.org/summer reads. And we have a link through bookshop.org that you can buy the book. Join us next month. We'll be discussing Mallory Macduff's book, Our Last Best Act, Planning for the End of Our Lives to Protect the Places and People We Love. And that webinar will be a special conversation including Dr. Ellen Davis. That'll be Monday, August 12th at 6 p.m. And you can register for that event on our summer reads page as well. And we'd also like to encourage you to check out our summer reading that our friends at the BTS Center are doing. Their next summer fiction book club will be next Tuesday, July 23rd at 12 p.m. Eastern. And they will be discussing the book Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich. You can learn more about that at thebtscenter.org. So thank you all again for joining us. Elizabeth, thank you for joining us. And everyone, have a great evening.
Take care.